The recipe box hit the bottom of the dumpster with a sound like a dropped hymnal. And Mallory didn't even look back to see if it landed right side up. "They're just index cards, Clara," she said, dusting flour off her hands like she'd just finished kneading bread, instead of throwing away 70 years of our grandmother's handwriting. "You correct commas for a living. Some of us actually make things." I stood there in Grandma Opal's kitchen, the one with the yellow curtains that still smelled like her even 3 weeks after the funeral. And I watched my sister turn back to the box of casserole dishes she was wrapping in newspaper. Like she hadn't just thrown away the only proof of who really wrote the cookbook she was about to sell. If you have ever watched someone you love get erased in real time and had to decide whether to say something or start gathering proof, tell me in the comments where you'd start. I want to hear it before we go further. My name is Clara Finch. I am 38 years old. I live in Nashville, and for the last 11 years, I have been a food editor and copy chief for a cookbook publisher, which means I spend my days making sure that when someone writes a pinch of salt, the pinch means the same thing on page 12 as it does on page 200. It is not glamorous work. It is not the work anyone puts on a dust jacket. But it is the work that keeps a recipe from being a fantasy and turns it into something a stranger in Ohio can actually put on their table. I tell you this because you need to understand what it meant when my sister said, "I only correct commas." She wasn't wrong about the commas. She was wrong about everything else. Grandma Opal died on a Tuesday in March, quietly, in her sleep, in the house she'd lived in since 1961. She was 89. She had outlived her husband by 20 years, and her own mother's recipes by generations, because she kept adding to them the whole time. Scribbling notes in the margins of index cards in handwriting that got shakier every decade, but never less precise. 3 tablespoons, not 2. Let it rest 15 minutes, not 10. She was, in her own quiet way, an editor too. She just never called it that. The recipe box itself was tin, painted with faded roses, a wedding gift from 1958. Inside it were maybe 200 cards, some typed on an old Smith Corona, most handwritten. A few stained with decades of butter and vanilla and the ghost prints of fingers that had touched them while stirring something on the stove. There was a card for chicken and dumplings with a coffee ring on the corner. There was a card for pound cake that said, "Ethel's Recipe, Improved, 1974. In Grandma's looping cursive. There was a card, near the back, for lemon chess pie, with a note in the margin that just said, "For Clara, when she's ready." I didn't know what "when she's ready" meant until much later. That's part of this story, too. The first time I understood something was wrong was at the estate sale planning meeting, 2 weeks after the funeral, in Mom's dining room, with the good tablecloth on, even though it was just family. My mother, June, sat at the head of the table with a legal pad. My cousin Paige sat across from me, scrolling her phone. And Mallory sat next to Mom with a folder I didn't recognize. "I've been thinking," Mallory said, "about what to do with Grandma's kitchen stuff. Most of it's just clutter. But I was talking to a friend who knows someone at a small publisher, and I think there might be something here. A cookbook. Grandma's recipes, my voice, that kind of thing." I remember setting down my coffee cup very carefully. "Whose voice?" I asked. "Mine," Mallory said, like it was obvious. I've been cooking her recipes for years. I know the stories behind them. I could write the head notes, do the photography, the whole package. I already have a working title. Roses and rolling pins. Paige looked up from her phone just long enough to say, "That's cute," and then went back to scrolling. I asked Mallory if she had talked to Grandma about this before she died. She said no, but that Grandma would have wanted her legacy preserved, and that someone needed to actually do something instead of just organizing the cards alphabetically in a drawer somewhere, which was apparently her idea of what I would do with them. I want to be honest with you. In that moment, I didn't say what I knew. I didn't say that 8 months before she died, Grandma Opal had called me into her sunroom, closed the door, and handed me a manila envelope with my name written on the front in her looping cursive. I didn't say that inside that envelope was a single typed page, notarized, that said she was assigning to me, Clara Finch, all rights, permissions, and copyright interest in her recipe collection, developed and refined over 61 years, to do with as I saw fit, so long as her name stayed on the work. I didn't say any of that because I was still grieving, and because some old habit in me wanted to give my sister the benefit of the doubt one more time, the way I always had, the way our whole family always did. That was mistake number 1. I would not make it again. The suffering, if I can call it that without sounding dramatic, came in small pieces over the following weeks, each one a little cut, each one with its own object attached, the way grief collects itself around things instead of feelings. The first object was the recipe box itself, sitting on the kitchen counter during the estate clean-out, while Mallory sorted through drawers and Mom labeled boxes for donation. I watched Mallory pull cards out one at a time, photograph a few with her phone, and set the box near the trash bags to deal with later. The object was a cardboard folder Mallory brought to the next family gathering, thick with printouts. She called it her pitch deck and passed it around the table like a menu. It had photographs of dishes I recognized instantly as Grandma's, but restyled, shot in Mallory's kitchen with Mallory's hands in the frame, holding Grandma's chicken and dumplings like she'd invented the dish herself. The third object was an email. Paige, of all people, forwarded it to me by accident, an old family group thread habit, CCing me instead of someone else. It was from a small independent publisher, a woman named Anika Reyes, acquisitions editor, responding to Mallory's initial pitch with cautious interest and one line that stuck with me. Please send over any rights documentation for the source material when convenient, just for our files. The fourth object was a text message from my mother, sent late at night, that said only, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Let your sister have this one." I read that message 4 times before I put my phone face down on the nightstand and lay in the dark for a long time. The fifth object was a voicemail from Mallory, breezy and quick, asking if I still had that old envelope thing Grandma gave you because she'd heard from Mom that there might be some paperwork floating around, and she wanted to make sure everything was in order before she signed anything. She didn't ask if I had rights. She asked if I had paperwork, like it was a formality to be cleared out of her way, not a legal fact that changed everything. And the sixth object, the one that actually made my hands go cold, was the printed manuscript sample Mallory left on Mom's kitchen table one Sunday, 40 pages of headnotes and recipes. My grandmother's chicken and dumplings recipe, retyped with a byline that read, "Recipes and Stories by Mallory Finch." No mention of Opal anywhere except a single dedication line at the front. For Grandma, who taught me everything. I stood in my mother's kitchen, holding those 40 pages, and something in me went very still and very quiet. The way it does right before I catch a factual error in a manuscript that's about to go to print. Not angry, not yet, just aware, suddenly, of every single detail I needed to verify before I said another word. That was the pivot. I stopped hoping my sister would do the right thing on her own, and I started building a file. I want to walk you through what that file actually contained, because this is the part of the story where my job, the job Mallory dismissed as comma correcting, turned out to matter more than anything else in the room. First, I drove to my apartment and found the manila envelope in my firebox, where I'd put it the day Grandma gave it to me, and mostly tried not to think about since. Inside was the notarized assignment, 1 page, dated 8 months before she died. Her signature shaky but legible, the notary's seal pressed into the corner. It read, in the flat language of legal documents, that Opal Louise Finch assigned to Clara Ann Finch, all copyright, all rights of reproduction, adaptation, and publication in her collected recipe works, known informally as the Recipe Box, with the sole condition that her name be credited as originator in any future publication. Second, I pulled up the email chain Paige had accidentally forwarded me, and I read it 3 more times, carefully, the way I read submissions at work, looking for what was said and what was carefully not said. Anika Reyes had asked for rights documentation twice. Mallory had responded both times with variations of working on gathering that, and it's a bit of a family situation, and never once with an actual document. Third, I went back through my own email and found something I'd forgotten I had. 4 years earlier, Grandma had asked me to help her organize her recipes into a binder for the family, just in case, she'd said. And I had spent a summer weekend at her kitchen table transcribing her handwriting into a shared document, correcting measurements where she'd clearly meant tablespoon instead of teaspoon, standardizing her oven temperatures, adding headnotes in her voice based on the story she told me while we worked. That document had a timestamp. It had my editorial comments in the margins, dozens of them, dated and time-stamped, showing exactly which recipes I had touched and when. It was, in the most literal sense, an editorial paper trail no one else in my family had. Fourth, and this was the piece that made my stomach drop when I found it, was a folder of texts between Grandma and me from the last year of her life, including one from 3 months before she died that said, "Told the girls today I'm leaving the recipes to you to finish properly." Mallory didn't seem to hear me, but I said it plain. I had read that text when it came in and assumed she meant something vague and sentimental. Reading it again, with everything else laid out in front of me, it read like testimony. I called Anika Reyes myself. I didn't plan to be sneaky about it. I introduced myself honestly, told her I was Clara Finch, that I worked in cookbook publishing myself, and that I understood she was in early conversations with my sister about a project involving our late grandmother's recipes. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause I recognized from my own job, the sound of someone recalculating. I did wonder, Anika said carefully, why the rights paperwork kept being delayed. In my experience, family recipe collections without a will or explicit gift language can get complicated fast, especially with photographs and personal essays layered on top. I appreciate you reaching out directly. Would you be willing to send over whatever documentation you have? Just so I understand the actual chain of ownership before we go any further. With anyone. I told her I would, and I did, that same night. Scanning the assignment document, the 4-year-old transcription file with my editorial timestamps, and the texts from Grandma, and sending them in a single organized email with a subject line that just said, "Documentation as requested." I did not send anything to Mallory. I did not send anything to Mom. I wanted the truth to exist somewhere clean, outside the reach of family pressure, before I said a single word out loud. If you've ever had to quietly build a paper trail while your family kept pretending nothing was wrong, drop a comment with the word documented. I want to know how many of you have been here. 3 days later, Anika emailed me back, polite and measured, in the way of someone who does this kind of due diligence for a living. She said the documentation was thorough and that she'd like to set up a joint video call with everyone involved, just to make sure we're all working from the same facts before any offer moves forward. She CC'd Mallory. I watched the little notification pop up on my phone and felt something settle. In my chest, that was almost relief. The first calm feeling I'd had in weeks. Mallory called me 40 minutes later. Not to apologize, not to ask questions, but to accuse. "Why would you go behind my back to my publisher?" she said, her voice already climbing. "This is exactly the kind of thing you do, Clara. You can't just let me have something without inserting yourself." "She's not your publisher yet," I said, and I didn't insert myself. "Grandma did that 8 months before she died." What is that supposed to mean? I told her, plainly, without embellishment, about the envelope, the assignment, the notary. I heard her breathing change on the other end of the line, quick and shallow. "That's not real," she said. "She never told me anything like that." "She told me," I said. "And she apparently told Mom, too, at some point, based on a text I have." There was a long silence. And then Mallory said the thing that I think, if I'm honest, I'd been braced for since the day she said it in Grandma's kitchen. Except this time, it came out sharper, more desperate. "You've never made anything in your life, Clara. You fix other people's sentences. I actually cook. I actually create. You just hide behind red pens and call it a career." I didn't yell back. I think that surprised her more than anything I could have said. I fixed thousands of recipes that would have failed in someone's kitchen if I hadn't caught the error, I said. I know exactly what it takes to turn a grandmother's handwriting into something a publisher can trust enough to print. That's not hiding. That's the actual work. You wanted the box without doing any of that work, and you wanted my name off it while you did it. She hung up on me. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time afterward, not shaking, not crying, just quiet. The way you feel after you finally said the true thing out loud instead of swallowing it. The video call was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 11 in the morning, and my mother insisted on joining too. So this doesn't turn into a war, which was, I think, her way of trying to referee something she'd already half decided the outcome of, in Mallory's favor. Paige asked to sit in as well, mostly, I suspect, out of curiosity, though she never said as much. We joined from 4 separate screens. Annika Reyes appeared first, professional, dark hair pulled back, a bookshelf visible behind her, stacked with the kind of cookbooks I recognized from my own shelves at home. Mallory joined next, sitting very straight, her hair done, wearing the kind of blouse she wore for photographs, not for cooking. My mother joined from her kitchen table, the same table where this whole thing had started weeks earlier. And I joined last, from my own small home office, with the manila envelope sitting on the desk in front of me, where the camera could see it if it needed to. "Thank you all for making time," Anika said. "I want to be straightforward about why I asked for this call. Before we discuss any contract terms, I need absolute clarity on who holds the rights to the source material, meaning Opal Finch's original recipes, notes, and any derivative work already produced from them." "This isn't personal," It's standard practice whenever a project is based on a deceased family member's unpublished material. I've reviewed some documentation sent to me, and I want to hear directly from everyone involved before we move forward. Mallory jumped in immediately, warm and practiced, the voice she used for pitch meetings. Absolutely. I completely understand. I've been the one developing this project from the beginning. I have the recipes, I have photography already shot, I have sample headnotes written. My grandmother and I were incredibly close, and this book is really a tribute to her. I appreciate that, Anika said, and I don't doubt the closeness. But closeness isn't the same as legal rights to publish. Can you tell me whether you have any written permission or assignment from Opal Finch, specifically authorizing you to publish her recipes and any biographical material under your own name? There was a pause. I watched Mallory's face on the small square of my screen, watched her calculate, the way I'd watched her calculate her whole life. From childhood arguments about whose turn it was to whose fault the broken lamp was. I don't have a formal document, Mallory said, but I don't think one exists for anyone. These are family recipes. There's no formal ownership of a chicken and dumplings recipe. There isn't ownership of a basic method, no, Anika said, gently but precisely. In the tone I recognized from my own job, the tone you use when you're correcting something important without humiliating the person. But there is ownership of a specific compiled collection, specific written headnotes, specific photographs, and specific personal essays derived from a person's life story. That's exactly the kind of material that can be assigned or willed, and if it has been, that assignment determines who can authorize its publication, regardless of who did the cooking. My mother spoke up then, her voice thin. Surely within a family, this doesn't need to be so formal. I understand the instinct, Anika said. But publishers get sued over exactly this kind of informality more often than you'd think. I'd rather sort it out now, cleanly, than after a book is printed. Then she turned, on the screen, toward my little square, and said the sentence I had been waiting 3 weeks to hear someone else say out loud. Clara, I actually want to address something directly with you, if that's all right. I received a scanned document a few days ago, a notarized assignment of rights. From Opal Finch to you, dated 8 months prior to her passing, along with a 4-year-old transcription file showing extensive editorial work you personally did on these recipes, timestamped and dated, and several text messages from Opal referencing her intent that you finish and steward this work. As of right now, that is the only rights documentation on file for this project. I need to ask you directly, in front of everyone, whether you're willing to confirm that you hold the assignment, and whether you consent to this project moving forward in any form. The room, if I can call 4 video windows a room, went completely silent. I watched Mallory's jaw tighten. I watched my mother's hand come up to cover her mouth. I can confirm that, I said. I have the original notarized document. I'm happy to send certified copies to your legal team. My grandmother gave it to me herself, in person, 8 months before she died. And she told me at the time that she wanted her recipes finished properly, with her voice intact, before anything went to print. I have no interest in publishing under my own name instead of hers. I want her name on the cover. That was always the condition she attached to it. That's not fair, Mallory said, and her voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since we were teenagers. I'm the one who actually loved cooking with her. I'm the one who has her hands, her instincts. Clara just writes things down. She corrects commas for a living, for God's sake, while I actually create something real. Anika didn't flinch. I don't doubt your love for your grandmother, she said, But affection isn't a legal right, and creative instinct without documented permission isn't something I can put a contract behind. Clara's role, from what I've seen in these files, isn't just correcting commas. She standardized measurements that were inconsistent across decades of handwriting. She preserved specific phrasing your grandmother used, and she has a documented, dated trail showing that work over years, not weeks. That's exactly the kind of editorial stewardship a project like this actually requires to be publishable and legally sound. I'm not in a position to move forward with anyone who doesn't hold the underlying rights. Regardless of how the material was developed emotionally, I want to tell you that Mallory apologized in that moment. That some window opened in her, and she saw what she'd done, standing in Grandma's kitchen with flour on her hands, tossing that tin box like it was nothing. That did not happen. What happened instead was worse, and in its own way, more honest. "Fine," Mallory said, her voice gone flat and cold. "Take it. Take the box, take the recipes, take the credit. You always wanted to be the one who mattered in this family anyway, hiding behind your little editing job. Acting like you're better than the rest of us because you know grammar rules. Enjoy your inheritance, Clara. I hope the commas keep you warm." She left the call. The little square just went black, replaced by a generic gray icon with her initials. My mother stayed on a moment longer, her face doing something complicated, somewhere between relief and shame. "I knew," she said quietly, not quite looking at the camera. "I knew Grandma had met with you about something. She told me, before she did it, that she wanted to talk to you privately about the recipes. I didn't say anything because I thought if I stayed out of it, it would sort itself out fairly on its own. I'm sorry, Clara. I should have said something sooner. I told her it was all right, though I'm not sure, even now, that it entirely was. Some kinds of silence cost more than the people keeping them ever seemed to understand at the time." Anika stayed on the call after the others logged off, and we spoke for another 20 minutes about what the actual project could look like, properly credited, properly sourced. She was kind about it, professional in a way that felt like relief after weeks of family static. "For what it's worth," she said near the end, "I've seen a lot of family cookbook pitches over the years. Most of them fall apart exactly like this, because someone assumes affection is the same thing as authorization. It rarely is. You clearly did the actual work of preservation. That matters more than people think, especially once lawyers get involved. If a neutral outsider has ever been the one who finally said the true thing your own family wouldn't, tell me who that person was for you. I read every comment, and I think this one matters." In the weeks after that call, things in my family did not resolve into anything like a movie ending. Mallory blocked the family group chat within 2 days, cutting herself off from Mom. Paige and me all at once. A single clean severance instead of an argument. She didn't call to yell, didn't send an angry text, just disappeared from the thread entirely. Her name replaced with a generic gray placeholder the next time anyone tried to tag her. Paige told me later that Mallory had told mutual friends I'd stolen the project. Out from under her, which stung in a distant way, the way an old bruise aches in cold weather. But I found I no longer needed her to understand the truth in order to live comfortably inside it myself. My mother and I talked more in the month after that call than we had in years. Careful conversations, some of them hard. She admitted, slowly, over several dinners, that she had always found it easier to let Mallory take up space in the family narrative because Mallory's wants were loud and immediate. while mine were quiet and patient. And patience, she said, had always looked to her like something that could wait. "I don't think I meant to make you invisible," she told me one evening, sitting at that same kitchen table. "I think I just kept assuming you'd be fine, because you always were." I should have asked what fine actually cost you. I didn't have a clean response to that. I told her I appreciated her saying it, which was true. Even if it didn't erase 3 decades of being the sister who was expected to absorb things quietly. The publishing project moved forward, eventually, under my name as rights holder and lead. Editor, with Grandma Opal listed as the author, exactly as she'd wanted. Anika and I worked together over the following months to shape the manuscript, and I found, to my own quiet surprise, that the work felt less like an obligation and more like a continuation of something Grandma and I had started together years earlier at her kitchen table, transcribing her handwriting 1 card at a time. I wrote headnotes based on the stories she'd told me directly, the ones about her own mother teaching her to make biscuits by feel instead of measurement, about the year the oven broke and she learned to adapt every recipe for a wood stove for 6 months, about the lemon chess pie she'd made for my grandfather every year on their anniversary until he died, and every year after that for herself, alone. Because she said some traditions don't need an audience to matter. I recovered the recipe box itself from the dumpster the same day Mallory threw it away, actually, though I never told anyone that until now. I'd driven back to Grandma's house that evening on some pretext about forgetting a casserole dish, and I'd found the box still sitting where it had landed, undamaged, except for a small dent in one corner. The tin roses, a little, more faded from a light rain that had fallen that afternoon. I carried it home in my lap the whole drive back, both hands on the lid, like it was something that could still spill. Most of the cards survived intact. A few had water damage at the edges, blurring some of the pencil notations. And those I had to reconstruct carefully from memory and from the transcription file I'd made years earlier, cross-referencing every measurement twice before I trusted it enough to put it into the manuscript. It was, in its own strange way, the most careful editorial work I have ever done in my career, because I understood, more than with any manuscript I'd ever touched professionally, exactly what would be lost if I got even a single detail wrong. If you've ever had to rebuild something precious after someone else tried to throw it away, tell me what that thing was. I want this comment section to be full of the things people saved. The book came out the following spring, titled simply Opal's Kitchen, with a small line under the title that read, "Recipes and Stories Preserved by Her Granddaughter, Clara Finch." Anika sent me an advance copy before it hit shelves, and I sat with it at my own kitchen table for a long time before I opened it, running my thumb along the embossed lettering of Grandma's name on the cover. I didn't hear from Mallory when the book was announced. I didn't hear from her when it was released, or when it started selling steadily in specialty bookshops around Nashville, or when a regional food magazine ran a short feature on family recipe preservation that used our story, gently anonymized. As an example of why documentation matters, even within families that love each other. I understand, in a distant way, why she stayed silent. Some kinds of loss are easier to carry in isolation than to acknowledge out loud. I don't know if she's read it. I don't know if she ever will. My mother reads it often, she tells me, usually late at night with a cup of tea, flipping to specific pages the way you'd revisit an old photograph. She told me last month that she'd started making Grandma's chicken and dumplings from the printed recipe instead of from memory, and that reading the headnote I'd written about Grandma teaching me to make biscuits by feel had made her cry at her own kitchen table, alone. The way Grandma used to eat that lemon chess pie alone on her anniversary. I think that's its own kind of repair. Imperfect and unequal. The kind where one person keeps working quietly, while another simply steps back from the wreckage they made and lets it be repaired without them. I still have the original recipe box on a shelf in my own kitchen now. The tin roses faded. The small dent still visible on one corner from its short trip through the air outside Grandma's back door. I don't keep it hidden away as some sacred, untouchable object. I use it. I pull cards from it the way Grandma did, the way her own mother probably did before her, hands a little dusted with flour. Measuring by feel more often than not now, because 11 years of correcting other people's precise instructions taught me exactly when precision matters and when it doesn't. Last weekend, I made the lemon chess pie for the first time since Grandma died. I pulled the card from near the back of the box, the one that says, "For Clara, when she's ready," in her looping cursive. And I understood. Finally. Sitting alone at my kitchen table, with the oven ticking as it cooled. Exactly. What she'd meant when she wrote that all those years ago. She hadn't just meant ready to bake the pie correctly, though the recipe itself is fussier than people expect. The filling needing exactly the right ratio of cornmeal to keep it from weeping. She'd meant ready to be the one who kept the whole thing safe. Ready to be trusted with something more than a family recipe? Ready to be the quiet person in the room who actually does the careful work, while everyone else assumes it doesn't count for much. The card sits on my counter now, a little dusted with flour from this weekend's baking. The ink slightly smudged at one corner where my thumb rested while I read it one more time before sliding the pie into the oven. It isn't behind glass. It isn't in a frame. It's exactly where a recipe card should be. Close enough to reach, close enough to use. Proof that the things worth keeping are rarely the ones anyone fights loudest for. In the moment, but the ones somebody quietly makes sure survive.